From the Caves and Wilds of Hindustan, H.P. Blavatsky. Series 2, Letter 4, A Fragment. I will cite this wonderful conversation in extenso, hoping that for a serious reader it will be interesting, not because, of course, that it has solved the questions that I have long tormented me personally, but because it explains the peculiar Vedantist view of the afterlife, its secrets, and generally of a human soul. For the sake of clarity, I allow myself to say a few preliminary words and thus make the subsequent conversation more understandable for the reader. Otherwise, someone unfamiliar with the philosophy of the Vedantist secret school, and especially with their complex theory of the soul and its significance in eternity, it would be very difficult to keep track of all these so diverse names of the spiritual man. They are innumerable, as are the names of their masked gods, because each aspect of the soul, or rather of the total spiritual aggregate, which is the Vedantists call a real person, or the spiritual personality, while his mortal body or earthly personality is considered an illusion. Each qualitative modification of the soul has its own special characteristic name. For example, they divide the earthly personality into three main groups: spirit, soul, and body, and then subdivide these groups into seven component forces or principles, of which the first two, spirit and divine soul, seat of the spirit, impersonal and without any qualities per se, while the other five are called kosha, that is the sheath or shell of various spiritual and earthly qualities of a person, therefore personal and qualitative. So Maya kosha in a literal translation would mean the elusive concept of the sheath, that is, the seat or receptacle of purely earthly and therefore the most elusive concepts of a man. This kosha is the sheath of the concepts of his earthly mind combined with the actions of five sense organs, which obscuring the divine pure mind with their coarse earthly concepts, thus turn all truth into a mirage. This theory is especially difficult for those who recognize in the creation of a separate soul for each person and rejecting the theory of his numerous reincarnations, thereby reject emanations, that is, the very essence of the pantheistic teaching of India. Reading, for example, about the sevenfold constitution of man, one might think that seven different personalities, seven demons, in the words of one Russian theosophist, dwell in us, and they are getting in their numerical order as if onion shells, more ethereal and subjective as they move away from the outer and grossest shell, that is, the body. But the philosophy of Vedanta preaches nothing of the kind. All these koshas were invented for the sake of clarifying its dogma about the absolute unity of Parabrahm, the foundation and substance of the entire manifested universe. If this dogma of the origin of a qualitative universe from a qualityless spirit is not explained by emanations, then this dogma would remain completely incomprehensible to the pantheists themselves. The spirit is one and indivisible, and the souls of humanity represent an uncountable number of individual units. These souls are emanations, spirits from the spirit, by since impersonal and qualityless unconditionality cannot be personally manifested. The outer side of Parabrahm, Mula Prakriti, its power and energy, the root of all that exists, manifests. Inseparable from Parabrahm, it together with Parabrahm constitutes the invisible universe. That which is separated is not Malaprakriti, but only light or radiance from the light of the universe, which is an emanation that turns into the visible universe. But here again the difficulty arises. Where is the place for the visible universe? How to place something where everything is already occupied, even in an infinite space, if in fact the space is the most omnipresent Sat? How finally can we extract qualitative matter from qualityless spirit, that is, from what is nothing in our minds? The Vedantists solve this difficulty as follows. The visible universe is nothing more than a phantom of our senses, and temporary illusion of temporary and deceptive concepts of an earthly person, which himself is an illusion and one kosha or sheath of the spiritual and therefore the only real person. Neither the visible world nor the objective man actually exist, for all that is visible and referring to consciousness through the testimony of our five senses is self-deception, because the only one, Sat, that exists and is. But before turning from a real nothing into even an illusory something, such a transformation must occur gradually. Radiance from the light is still a qualityless parabrahm and therefore incapable of action. And now the shadow, of course, also illusory, for there is no shadow without a body, and parabrahm is incorporeal, begins in the gradual differentiation of its unconscious action. Nota bene, unconscious only in our conventional concept of self-consciousness. To transform from the qualityless and impersonal into the qualitative and personal, that is, first into the visible worlds, then into man. But man, like the worlds, could not be created at once, even in that gross shell in which we imagine him to be seen. It was created and formed in the following order. Group 1. 1. Brahma or Atman, a ray of Parabrahm or spirit. 2. Buddhi is its Vahana or carrier, the vehicle of the spirit, supreme or divine soul. This dual unit is the root of man, although in our concept this impersonal and qualityless unit is a pure abstraction. Its individuality begins to be formed and outlined only after many incarnations, since Buddhi, in order to acquire even spiritual qualities, must, taking them away from the death of the earthly personality, get them from the first principle of the second group, Manas. Group 2. 3. Manas is the seat of mind. Together with Kamarupa, say below, this is the real earthly personality, the ego of a person or the body inhabited by it, and is called the human or earthly soul when it is considered in its separation from Buddhi or divine soul. In unity with Buddhi, it is called Suratma, soul thread, since it is the only one of these threefold group changing into its personal qualities follow the first group in all its earthly incarnations. 4. Kamarupa is the seat of desires. This principle survives a person, but together with 5. Mayavi Rupa, the illusory body or double of the personality eventually disappears. These fourth and fifth principles are transformed after the death of a person into pishachas, or those materialized spirits in which the spiritualists see the souls of their dead, but the Brahmins demons. Group 3. 6. Jiva, or life. 5. Principle. 7. Sthula Sharira, or the human body, the mask of the soul. This group is the most short-lived of all illusions, which disappears without a trace after its destruction. Thus we see that these three groups, with their 7 divisions, are summed up by the divine soul. An impersonal and qualityless unit must acquire personality and spiritual qualities from each new manas, that is, from the rational ego, and not in one but in the countless series of its incarnations, before it can manage to become a godlike person, with it to unite even temporarily with Sat and cease to be an illusion. It must go through all stages of human suffering, personally experience everything experienced by helpless humanity, make personal efforts to cleanse itself of earthly dirt, extracting from the personalities inhabited by it only the higher spiritual qualities, if any, burn out like gold in the fire. Every new incarnation is a new step towards purification and perfection. All this is so that at the end of the centuries all past humanity could also truly live in God, as God will live in the future humanity in the seventh, teach the Vedantists of the secret school, calling present humanity only the fifth. And now the following conversation with the Thakur will become clearer to the reader. Narayan asked the Thakur, amid a heated argument with the poor Babu. What is he saying, and is it possible to listen to it? So that after death will there be absolutely nothing left of a person? Can there be that the body, as he assures, simply decomposes into its constituent elements, and what do we call the soul, and he calls temporary self-awareness, evaporates, disappearing like steam over boiling water? What is about this strange? The Babu is a Charvaka, and therefore he says only what every other Charvaka will tell you. But the Charvakas are lying. There are others who believe that a real person is not his physical shell, but lies in his mind, in the seat of his self-consciousness. But can self-consciousness leave the soul even after our death? In his case, maybe, the Thakur answered in the same cool manner, because he sincerely and firmly believes in what he is now preaching. Narayan threw a surprised, confused look at the Thakur, and the Babu, who was afraid of the latter, gave us a triumphant smile. But how so? After all, the Vedanta teaches that the spirit of the spirit is immortal and the human soul doesn't die in Parabrahm. Are there any exceptions? There can be no exceptions in the basic rules of the spiritual world, but there are rules for the sighted and rules for the blind. I understand it, but in this case, as I taught him, his complete and final disappearance of self-consciousness is nothing more than an aberration of a blind man who, not seeing the sun, denies it, but he will see it with spiritual eyes after death. He won't see anything, denying it during his lifetime, as he will not see it beyond the grave. Noticing that Narayan was terribly worried, and that even the colonel and I were staring at him, waiting for a more definite answer, the Thakur seemed reluctantly continued. You speak of the spirit, of the Atman, and you confuse the spirit with the soul of a mortal, that is, with Manas. The spirit is undoubtedly immortal, for it is without beginning and therefore without end. But now the case in question is not the spirit, but the human self-conscious soul. You confuse it with the first, and the Babu denies both spirit and soul. Both of you don't understand each other. I understand him, but don't you understand me? I will try to express myself more clearly. The whole point of your question is reduced to the following. You want to know if it is possible, even in the case of an inveterate materialist, a complete loss of his self-consciousness and self-awareness after his death, don't you? Am I right? Because he completely denies everything that for us constitutes an undoubted truth in which we all secretly believe. All right, to this I believe in as sacredly as you do in our teaching, which calls the posthumous period, that is, the intermediate time between two lives, only a temporary state. Answer in the affirmative and say whether this interval between two acts of life illusion can last 1 year or a million years. The afterlife state can, without any violation of the rules, turn out to be exactly the state of a person being in a dead faint. The Babu, therefore, is right in his case. But why? And how? Since the rule of immortality doesn't have, as you tell us, any exceptions, inquired the colonel. It doesn't, of course, for everything as really exists. The one who has studied the Mundaka Upanishad and Vedanta Sara should not even ask. But the Mundaka Upanishad teaches, Narayan said timidly, that between Buddhi and Manas, as between Ishvara and Prajna, in fact, there is no more difference than between the forest and its trees, between the lake and its waters. Quite rightly, because one or even 100 trees that have dried up from the loss of life sap or torn up by their roots cannot prevent a forest from remaining the same forest. So, but in this comparison, Buddhi represents a forest, and Manas Taijasi represents trees. And if the first is immortal, then how, being the same as Buddhi, can Manas Taijasi completely lose consciousness before its new incarnation? This is what embarrasses me. It's in vain if you only take the trouble not to confuse the abstract representation of the whole with its incidental modifications. Remember that if we can say, when speaking of Buddhi, it is absolute immortal, then the same cannot be said about Manas or Taijasi. Neither one nor the other exists separately from the divine soul, because the first is a quantitative distribute of the earthly personality, and the second did the same as the first, only with a reflection of Buddhi in itself. In turn, Buddhi would remain only an impersonal spirit without this element in itself, borrowed by it from the human soul, and which conditions and makes of it something, as it were, separate from the universal soul for the entire duration of the cycle of human incarnations. If you say, therefore, that Buddhi-Manas can neither die nor lose consciousness either in eternity or during transition periods, and then, according to our teaching, you would be right. But to apply this axiom to the qualities, it's the same as you would insist that since the soul of Colonel O is immortal, then the blush on his cheeks must also be immortal. It turns out that you have obviously confused essence with phenomenon in your conceptions, and forgot that in unity with Manas of human soul only, the radiance of Taijasi itself becomes a matter of time, since both immortality and the consciousness beyond the grave become for the earthly human personality completely conditional qualities depending on the conditions and beliefs created by it itself during the life of its body. Karma, the law of retribution, operates continuously, and we reap in the afterlife the fruits only of what we ourselves have sown in this life. But if my ego can find itself after the destruction of my body in a state of complete unconsciousness, then what can be the punishment for me in this for the sins of my life? Asked the colonel, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Our philosopher teaches that punishment befalls the ego only in the future incarnation, and immediately behind the grave only rewards await us for the suffered and undeserved suffering in earthly life. All punishment, as you can see, consists in the absence of a reward, in the complete loss of consciousness of one's happiness and peace. Karma is a child of the earthly ego, the fruit of actions of its visible personality, even of thoughts and intentions of the spiritual self, but it is also a gentle mother who heals the wounds it inflicted in the previous life before it castigates this ego again, inflicting new ones on it. If there is no such grief or misfortune in the life of a mortal, that would not be the fruit and direct consequence of sin in his previous existence, then without retaining the slightest memory of this in his present life, and feeling himself not deserving such punishment and therefore suffering guiltlessly as a result for this alone, the human soul is worthy of consolation and complete rest and peace in the afterlife. For your spiritual self, death is always a deliverer and a friend, the serene sleep of a baby or a dream full of blissful visions and dreams. But as far as I remember, the periodical incarnations of the Sutra Atma are likened in the Upanishad of earthly life, alternating between sleep and wakefulness. Is that so? I asked, wanting to resume Narayan's first question. It is right, this comparison is very true. No doubt, only I do not understand it well. After sleep, another day begins for a person, and his soul as well as his body are the same as the day before, while with each new incarnation, not only his outer shell, gender, and personality change, but apparently all his spiritual qualities. And how can this comparison be true in view of the fact that people haven't got up from sleep? Remember well not only what they did yesterday, but also many days, months, and even years ago, and yet in their present life they do not retain the slightest recollection of any past life. After all, the awake person may perhaps forget that he saw in his dream, but he nevertheless knows that he was asleep and that during his sleep he was alive. As for the past life, we do not even know this. How is so? There is those, perhaps, who knows that Akur said somehow mysteriously, without answering a direct question. I suspect, but not us sinners. Therefore, how can we, who have not reached even Sammasambuddha, understand this comparison, studying and understanding more correctly the characteristic and three types of what we call sleep? Well, it's pretty difficult. Even our greatest physiologists have only got confused with this subject, and by failing to explain themselves have confused us even more. The colonel laughed. Because they are wrong persons for the job. It is a psychologist's job, but there are none of them in Europe, at least among scientists. Western psychiatrists are the same physiologists, only under a different name, and act on the basis of even more materialistic principles. You can read even Maudsley and you will see that they cure mental illness not believing in the existence of the soul itself. But we are again moving away from the subject of our inquiries, which you do not seem any desire to explain us, the Thakur Sahib. You definitely confirm and prove the Baba's theories, and he wants to prove precisely on the grounds that we know nothing about our past earthly life, nor about life about death, that there is no consciousness behind the coffin and cannot be. I say again, the Babu is a Charvaka who repeats what he was taught. I confirm and approve not the materialistic system itself, but only the correctness of the views of the Babu himself as regards his personal afterlife state. So does it turn out that people like the Babu shouldn't be an exception to the general rule? Not at all. Sleep is a general and unchangeable rule both for man and for every earthly creature. But there are different types of sleep and even more different dreams. But he denies more than one consciousness in the afterlife and in its dreams, speaking in the language of Vedanta Sara. He rejects immortal life in general as well as the immortality of his own spirit. In the first case, he acts completely according to the canons of modern European science based on the evidence of our five senses. In this he is sinful only in front of those who do not share his opinions. In the second case he is no less right. Without a preliminary inner consciousness and belief in the immortality of the soul, it cannot become Buddhita, it will remain Manas. But Manas only cannot be immortal. In order to live a conscious life in the afterlife, one must first believe in it in earthly life. On these two aphorisms of the secret science, our entire philosophy about posthumous consciousness as well as about the immortality of the soul is built. Sutraatma always gets what it deserves. After the destruction of the body, it has either a period of complete vigilance or a chaotic dream or a deep sleep without visions and dreams. If your physiologists have found the cause of visions and dreams in the unconscious preparation of them during period of wakefulness, why not admit the same in relation to posthumous dreams? I repeat what Vedanta teaches. Death is sleep. After death, before the spiritual eyes of the soul, a performance begins according to the program we memorized during our life and often made by ourselves. The practical fulfillment of our correct beliefs or the illusions created by us ourselves. These are the posthumous fruits of the tree of life. It is clear that belief or unbelief in the fact of conscious immortality cannot affect the unconditional reality of the fact itself as long as it exists. But both the faith and the lack of faith in it of individuals cannot but condition the actions of this fact in its application to each in particular. Now I hope you understand, don't you? I'm starting to understand. Materialists not believing in anything that is not tested by their five senses and the so-called scientific intelligence and rejecting any spiritual manifestation point to earthly life as the only conscious existence. Therefore, they will be later recompensed by belief or in their case by unbelief. They will lose their personal self, fall asleep in an unconscious sleep until a new awakening. Is not it? Almost so. You may add that the Adventists, while recognizing two kinds of conscious existences, earthly and spiritual, point only to the latter as an irrefutable reality. Earthly life, due to its variability and short duration, is only an illusion of deceptive feelings. Our life in the spiritual spheres, for one thing, must be recognized as reality, that our never-changing, infinite and immortal self, the Sutratma, lives in them, while with each new incarnation it dresses in a temporal personality completely different from the previous temporary one, in which everything except its spiritual prototype is doomed to traceless destruction. But excuse me, the Thakur, is it possible that a person, my earthly conscious self, can perish not only temporarily, as in the case of the materialists, but even without a trace? According to our teaching, it should even perish in such a way, and in all its fullness. Moreover, its principle, uniting with the Buddhi, became purely spiritual, making up with the latter henceforth and forever one indestructible whole. But in the case of an inveterate materialist, it may happen that since neither consciously nor unconsciously exactly nothing of his personal self has ever been reflected in Buddhi, then the latter doesn't have to carry away a single atom of this earthly personality into eternity. Your spiritual self is immortal, but of your real personality it will take with it only that which deserves immortality, that is, only the aroma of a flower cut by death. Well, what about the flower itself, or the earthly self? The flower itself, like all past and future flowers that bloomed and will bloom afterwards on the native branch, Sutratma, the children of non-Buddhi root, will turn to dust. Your real self is not, as you yourself must know, your body sitting in front of me, not your Sutratma, but Sutratma Buddhi. But this doesn't explain to me why you call the afterlife immortal, endless, real, and earthly life an illusion. After all, according to your teaching, it turns out that the afterlife has its limits, that although longer than the earthly one, it should still have its end. Without a doubt, the spiritual ego of a person moves in eternity like a pendulum between the hours of life and death. But if these hours, periods of earthly life and life beyond the grave, are limited in their continuation, and even the every number of such stages in eternity between sleep and vigilance, illusion and reality, has its beginning as well as end, then the spiritual pilgrim himself is eternal. Therefore, the hours of his afterlife, when being unveiled, he stands face to face with the truth, and not with the mirages of his temporary earthly existence during the period of his wanderings, which we call the cycle of birth, constitute the only reality in our views. Such intervals, regardless of their finiteness, do not only interfere with Suratma constantly improving to follow steadily all the time, although gradually and slowly along the path to its final transformation, when it, having achieved the goal, becomes a divine being. They not only contribute to the attainment of this goal, but without such finite intervals Sutratma Buddhi would never have reached it. Sutra Atma is an actor, and numerous and diverse incarnations are its roles. Can't you call, I suppose, these roles, much less their costumes, the personality of the actor himself? Like him, the soul is made to play different roles during the cycle of births before reaching the very threshold of paranirvana. There are many often unpleasant roles for it, but as a bee collects honey from each flower, leaving the rest as food for earthworms, so our spiritual individuality, Sudratma, collecting only nectar of spiritual qualities and self-knowledge of each earthly personality into which karma makes her incarnate, finally merges all these qualities together, being then a perfect being, Dhyan Jahan. So much the worse for earthly personalities from whom it did not manage to collect anything. Such personalities, of course, do not consciously live in their earthly life. So, is immortality for an earthly personality still a relative question, and immortality itself is absolute? No, not at all. It only doesn't extend to non-existence, for everything that exists as Sat or emanates from Sat, immortality, like infinity, is absolute. Mula Prakriti is the other side of Parabrahm, but both are the same. The essence of all this, that is spirit, force, matter, is infinite as well as beginningless, but the form acquired by this tribal unity during incarnations, the appearance is of course only one illusion of personal concepts. Therefore we call real afterlife alone, and the earthly one, including the earthly personality itself, we call illusionary. But why then should we call reality sleep and illusion wakefulness? The comparison is made to facilitate our presentation. From the point of view of earthly concepts, it is very true. Why, if the afterlife is based on justice, on a well-deserved recompense for all earthly sorrows, and Suratma uses the slightest glimpse of spiritual qualities in each of its incarnations, then how we can allow the spiritual personality in our Babu? He left, and we can talk about him without hesitation, so that the personality in this boy is so perfectly honest, noble, infinitely kind, in spite of all his unbelief, so that this personality, I say, doesn't pass into immortality, but perishes like manure from a flower. Who besides him doomed him to such a fate? I have known the Babu since his early age, and I am quite sure that the harvest from him by Sudratma will be abundant, although his lack of faith and materialism are far from being faint. Nevertheless, he cannot die forever and in the fullness of his personality. But the Taco, hadn't you just now confirmed the correctness of his views on his personal state in the next world, and he thinks that after death all consciousness will disappear in him? Yes, I have confirmed, and still do. Sleeping you can miss several stations on the railroad, and still, without retaining the slightest memory about them, you wake up at the next one and reach the destination already in a conscious state. Are you taking the comparison between sleep and death? So remember that even a human being knows three kinds of sleep: sound, without the slightest dream; sleep with chaotic vague dreams; finally the one with dreams so vivid and clear that for the sleeper they become for a while a complete reality. Why then can you not admit that this happens with the soul freed from the body? After parting with it, for the soul, depending on its merits and most importantly on its faith, life is either completely conscious or semi-conscious, or the soul falls into a deep sleep without dreams. as well as without consciousness, which is equal to a state of obscurity. This is the fulfillment of the program of which I spoke, composed and prepared in advance for themselves by materialists. There are no two materialists alike. An evil person, or even just a great egoist, who adds indifference to the whole world to his complete lack of faith, must certainly leave his personality on the threshold of death forever. It has nothing to cling to your Suratma with, and with your last breath any connection between them is cut off. But people like the Babu will only miss one station in his sleep. The time will come when he too will realize himself again in eternity, and will repent that he had lost even one day from eternal life. But is it more accurate to say that death is a birth to a new life, or even better, a return to eternity? In fact, it is so, and I have nothing against rephrasing, but only with our conventional notions of material life, the words live and exist are inapplicable to the purely subjective state of posthumous being, and if they were used in our philosophy without a deep knowledge of all its explanations, then the Vedantists would very soon come to strange ideas which prevail in our time among American spiritualists, who preach about spirits marrying both spirits and mortals. As with true, not nominal Christians, the afterlife of the Adventists is the country where there are no tears, neither sighs, where they neither marry nor are given in marriage. Therefore, due to the fact that the life of the unveiled soul, possessing all the vitality of reality, as in other dreams, doesn't have any of the crudely objective forms of earthly life, suitable only for bodily feelings, compared by our philosophers to dreaming during sleep. And now I seem to have explained everything.